Open Table, reclaiming the virtue of hospitality.
Now I'm hungry. What's new? I'd like to introduce you to someone who's very important to me. And so I'm going to show you a picture of Richard K. Opp. This is my grandfather. We're playing Batman and Robin, I think, at this point, using dish towels and what appears to be the plastic rings that they outlawed because they were killing sea turtles. And so that's what we're doing. He was my hero growing up. I love my grandfather. He was one of my favorite people in the entire planet. And one of the things I was reflecting on this week is just how different his life was than mine. When he was 14, his dad left their family, 5 kids and his mom, and left them in profound financial instability. And so he had to go to work. He started working at a lumber mill. He worked there at the age of 14. Minimum wage was 3 cents. And then the Great Depression hit. And they had a mandated minimum wage raised to 7.5 cents. But because of that, the lumber mill couldn't keep all the people. And so my grandfather was actually kept on the job because he had more dependents than the guy working next to him who only had 5 dependents. This is just the world he lived in. When the Great Depression hit, after that, he was shipped to Tennessee with the Tennessee Valley Authority. He hated it. He sent money home, but he still hated it. They sent him back home, and he lived there for a few years. And then he got married, and World War II broke out. And like the rest of so many of the young men in the United States, he was swept up into war, and he was stationed in the European theater. And he served in the army. That's what he did, like so many other men. And he was part of the second wave into France. Right after D-Day, he came in the second wave behind and marched through western, central, and eastern France, through Germany and the Black Forest. And this past week, I actually had the chance to go on vacation with our family. We went to France. My wife studied there in college. I got to see some of the very places that my grandfather would have marched, would have gone through. I got to see them very differently. I was on trains and taxi cabs and rental cars, but he would have seen it very differently. Just such a wildly different life experience than mine. And that's where I was in that zone, just looking at this nation that my grandfather would have gone to as well as part of World War II. I just started geeking out on World War II a little bit. And it was just kind of an incredible time in human history. And 400,000 U.S. soldiers lost their lives in this combat. And there was actually, I read this, there was actually more medals of honor given during World War II than any other war in U.S. history, by kind of a large margin. There's 472 medals of honor. And it was pretty incredible. And it was interesting, I started geeking out on that too. I actually went through, and they have lists, and I got to read every single Medal of Honor recipient, who they were, where they were from, and what they received the award for. And it was interesting because as I was reading through all 472, whether they were Navy or Air Force or the Marines or the Army, I got to see and there was this one act that kept coming up again and again. Now, the Medal of Honor, if you don't know, is given posthumously to somebody who has died doing something heroic in the field of battle, often saving the lives of people who are doing something very important, to great personal sacrifice, to the death of themselves. And there was one act that kept coming up again and again and again. It's about 50 or 60% of all Medals of Honor were awarded for folks who dove on grenades to save the battalion. This is a picture of American GIs in kind of foxholes. You can imagine if a grenade comes in there, right? I mean, it's gonna kill everyone. And if you don't know anything about grenades, there's a 7 to 10 second fuse. The soldier takes it, waits a second or two, throws it, it travels through the air. And when it lands, there's not much time left. And what scientists tell us is psychologically and mentally and cognitively, there's no time to really make a decision. You don't sit there and go, okay, hold on, that grenade's gonna go off and kill everyone. I don't like him. These 3 guys are cool. You see what I mean? You're not processing. You're not going through a mental process of determining whether or not the people in the foxhole are worth your life. You just do it or you don't, right? And these men that did this, that dove on the grenade to sacrifice themselves for the people in that foxhole, these men, they made this decision, but it's not really a decision. It's actually what we would call a virtue. See, the decision had already been made a long time before, do you see? They had practiced dying to themselves and using the whole of their lives to protect their platoon and their brothers in arms hundreds and thousands of times in little decisions before that. They had made this decision and had marked it all the way back. They had been practicing this. This is what a virtue is. A virtue is an old-fashioned word that we don't use very much, but it's very important. It's very important to the Christian life. It's very important to the Bible. It's very important to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It's something that you practice hundreds, even thousands of times that actually forges your character toward God. Now, the opposite of virtue is the word vice. You might have heard that, vice. A vice is something that you also practice, that you do over and over again, that actually forges your character in the opposite direction. It helps you become a worse version of yourself, further away from God. And that's the opposite of a virtue. A virtue is something you practice again and again and again for the sake of becoming a different sort of character. So in essence, that soldier who dove on that grenade, all those men who did that, they didn't just jump on a grenade. They were the kind of men who jumped on grenades. Does that make sense? They had forged that in themselves. And that's what a virtue is. It's something that we practice again and again in order to become better. For the next 3 weeks, and starting last week, Karina Gerard kind of kicked us off in this Open Table series. The title of this is Open Table, Reclaiming the Virtue of Hospitality. We're going to be looking at hospitality, but in order to do this, we're going to have to examine what the word virtue means. We're going to be answering that question. We're going to be answering the question, what is hospitality? That's another question. What is a table? We got that one covered. You guys got that? Good. So it's going to be shorter sermon. We don't have to deal with that. We just move right on through. The virtue of hospitality. We're going to talk about the word hospitality. And whenever the word hospitality appears in the New Testament, it's one singular word. It's a Greek word. I'm going to show it to you, and you might recognize it. It's the word philoxenos, or philoxenia in the adjectival form. And so this word philoxenos is a compound word made of 2 words in the Greek. Philo, meaning love, and xenos, meaning stranger. Now, a stranger is somebody who's not like you. They don't live near you. They're just not like you. You can understand what this means. And the opposite of philoxenos is another word you might have heard. It's the word xenophobia, fear of one who is strange or different. That's a word, and that word appears all the time. Now, we see that all the time. Xenophobia is literally the difference of philoxenia. So when the Bible talks about hospitality, this is what it means. This word is loaded with all sorts of implications. Philoxenia is the love of the stranger. And it was very important to the New Testament church and to the early church writers. There's this guy named Paul who wrote a series of letters trying to explain to the early Christians how to live out this life of Christ, how to play the symphony that Christ had played and lived on earth, how to become the people of God. And there's this moment he's writing to a young pastor, an elder in the church, a leader in the church named Timothy. And he makes a list of non-negotiable traits for church leadership. Paul says these things are essential to anyone who wants to be a leader in the Christian church. And listed in that is philoxenia, hospitality. Paul says, if you don't have a heart that is open towards strangers, you cannot be in church leadership. You're disqualified. So this is a big deal. Paul lists this as a non-negotiable trait, but it goes even further than that. In the first century, in Acts chapter 2, the church was exploding and God was doing this amazing thing. And all of these people from different ethnic backgrounds, different ethnoses, different religions, different continents, different areas, they were all coming together and God was doing this incredible work. And he was blending them all together. And it says in Acts chapter 2 that they had hospitality, philoxeno. They didn't fear each other, that God was actually bringing them together as different people, a community of difference, people coming together, and they were being brought together. And they had not a fear of one another, but they opened their hearts to one another. This is hospitality was one of the hallmarks of the early church. But it goes even further than that. In the first and second century, the early church expanded and grew rapidly because of this very trait of hospitality. Karina talked about this last week. We're going to talk about it a little bit more. But the first and second centuries, the Roman Empire was very antagonistic toward this early church, this group, this sect of Christian believers. They persecuted them. They fed them to the animals. They would kill them. There was all sorts of persecution. Upon threat of death, they would take their property. They would take their lives. And so in the middle of this, how did the church grow? Well, the church grew because for the first time in human history, you had actually the chance to choose your religion. This was the first religion you could choose. You weren't born into it. You chose it. And when you chose it, you became part of this family, this philoxena, this hospitality marked the early church because they welcomed people. And it wasn't something that the church did or a celebrity pastor did. It was something that an average, ordinary Christian would do, would embody. And it was so unbelievably transformative that it changed the ancient Roman Empire because average, ordinary people were open to people who were different, who had philoxenos. Now, why did the early church do all this? Why was philoxeno? Because why did they do it? Well, they did it because they believed it was actually part of the character of Jesus Christ. That Jesus had modeled it, and as little Christians, as little Christs, as Christians, they wanted to become like this man, this Savior, this God who became king, and they wanted to be like him. And so they modeled their lives after this. In fact, when Jesus was asked, hey, Jesus, what are the most important aspects out of all the Jewish religion? There's 1,000 years of history. What's the most important thing? Can you boil it down for us? He said, yeah, two things. Love God and love your neighbor. Now, you know this, right? We've said this a million times at Westgate. These are the core doctrines of Westgate. Love God, love one another, and love your neighbor. And this is from Matthew 22. When Jesus is asked, what are the most important things? Jesus says, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, Jesus is actually quoting from Leviticus 19:18. And in that verse, Moses and God are talking, and God is giving Moses directives for how God's people should live. And God says to Moses, tell the people that they are to love their neighbor as themselves. This is where this verse is coming from. This is the verse that Jesus is quoting. And this word, neighbor, means someone who is living among you. It does not mean a family member or someone from your tribe. It means someone who is different than you, who is living among you. And God says to the Israelites through Moses, he says, they are to love the one who is living among them as they love themselves. So this is a person who's a refugee. This is a person who is fleeing famine. This is a person who is poor. This is a person who has been displaced. This is a person who is living in the Israel nation who is not an Israelite, a stranger. And God says, you are to love them as yourself. This is the verse that Jesus uses when he quotes, love your neighbor as yourself in Matthew 22. And if you read it, and feel free to, it's fantastic because in the preceding verses in Leviticus 19, 8, 9, 10, 11, Moses and God have this conversation and God gives some commands and he says, here's how you are to treat the stranger who is in your midst. Here's how you're to treat him. You're not even supposed to glean to the edges of your field. When you harvest your crops, leave some edges around the outside. Because these refugees and those fleeing famine and those who are poor and the widow and the orphan, they don't have no one to look out for them. And so I want you to leave a band of crops around the edges of your field. Don't go to the edges. Leave it for them so that they can harvest it. That is how you are to show tangibly that you are open to them, that you're for them, because they'll have nowhere to go. The widows and the orphans and the refugees, they have nowhere to go. So God says to the people of Israel, your work should look different than every other nation in the history of the world. It should look different. People should be able to see with their eyes instantaneously that the way that you grow crops is different, because you don't harvest to the edges, but leave some. This is where Jesus quotes. This is the verse that Jesus chooses to quote when he says, love your neighbor as yourself. This neighbor is a stranger. And Jesus is basically inviting, in the early churches says that we can turn, with this hospitality, we can turn strangers into neighbors and neighbors into friends. That this is actually the heart of who Jesus is. This is what he does. And that if we want to become like him, this is who we must become as well. This is a hard thing to do. This is the virtue of hospitality. This is a difficult thing. And you know now why we have to practice it, because it's hard. It does not come naturally. Humans forever, for millennia, have stuck together with people that are like them. That's what we like to do. We like to hang out with the people who think and believe and behave and look just like us. That's just what humans do. So this is not only countercultural, this is counter-human instinct. But in the middle of this, Jesus comes to show us a new way to be human. Now, this is tough for a number of reasons, because again, when you hear the word hospitality, you probably didn't think about love of a stranger or having a heart that is open towards somebody who is different. When you hear the word hospitality, perhaps you're like me and you put an adjective in front of it. Southern hospitality, I do declare. I got the vapors. Sorry. Blanche Devereaux comes back. I have no idea why. That was a Golden Girls reference. 9 of you got that. I feel you. All right, so when I think of hospitality, I think of all of these elaborate dishes where people do elaborate things. Like search on Instagram. Here's one. This is what I think. Like that's like an infinity table, you know. Like, how many guests exactly are you expecting? That's a staggering amount. This is another one. This is a table filled with people. There are so many people that couldn't even afford chairs. I don't know. This was a wedding I saw. I guess they went back in time to 1985 and got a Libyan terrorist van. I'm not sure. That's a Back to the Future reference. Stay with me. Here it is. All right. Make like a tree and get out of here. This is actually a birthday party for a 1-year-old. And everyone here knows if you have kids, that's just stupid. That's just, they're not even going to remember. That's not for them. This is another birthday party. This is a mother who just said, I just threw it together. Yeah. Now, this is what we think of when we think hospitality, right? And this is impossible, right? These images are impossible to keep up with. In fact, one of my favorite things to do is look at those like Pinterest fails where people try to do something. Here's a unicorn cake. This is one of my favorites. Here's how it's supposed to look. It looks like it's been stabbed in the head. Is that blood dripping? I don't know. Hide your kids, hide your wife. I don't know. That's just frightening stuff. Because we fail, right? If this is the bar. My buddy, he had a 3-year-old, and his 3-year-old son loved Sesame Street and Elmo, and so he went on Pinterest and saw like these Cookie Monster cupcakes. You know, C is for cookie. Yum, 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 yum. You know, it was awesome. And so he posted pictures. He's like, he tried to make these. Here's how it turned out. Not great. That's going to traumatize the children. I don't know. Like face melted off. Like, it's just very, So look, if that's what you think of with hospitality, right? Then this is why it's so difficult. This is what we have in our head is hospitality. This is not hospitality, that's entertaining. And there's a difference, right? That's entertaining. And here's the thing, as that just showed, entertaining is hard. It is hard. You got to have all sorts of stuff. You got to have a room. You got to have space. You got to have a backyard. You got to have infinite tables. You got to have infinite pillows you got to have like little, and it's hard. It's hard. It's hard. And listen, if you're good at entertaining, God bless you. okay? But some of us cannot make our pumpkin so sparkly in October, okay? We can't decorate pine cones that well. So leave us alone, because it's hard. Anyway, entertaining is hard. It's just difficult, right? And if that's what it is, but this is not at all what God is calling us to, because entertaining is hard, but hospitality is much harder. And here's why. Because entertaining is something that you do, but hospitality reveals who you are and how open you are to those who are radically different than you. And in doing that, what is revealed is not just that we don't have enough space or enough throw pillows, but what's revealed is that our hearts are actually not very much like Jesus at all. And that hurts. And so we run away. It's just too painful. So entertaining is hard, but man, hospitality is even more difficult because it reveals that we are actually not very much like Jesus at all. So, a couple other thoughts about the difference between entertaining and hospitality, just so we're clear about what Jesus is expecting, what the Bible talks about, and what is not. Okay, so here's some differences between hospitality and entertaining. You probably already have them in your head, but we're going to deconstruct this, okay? So, first of all, with entertaining, it's often exclusive. You have an exclusive guest list that you're inviting. It's not for everybody, it's only for certain people. Number two, it's usually a performance, right? You bring out your best china, you clean up, you make sure everything is clean, you provide your best dish, right? Those kinds of things. Third, there's a clear guest and a clear host, right? You're my guest, I'm your host, et cetera, et cetera. There's a clear guest-host relationship. Fourth, it's often sporadic in timing. It's every so often. Fifth, there's a sense of reciprocity. I'll have you over. No, we'll have you over. We'll have you over. We'll have you over. Here's a bottle of wine. So there's a back and forth, right? I'm going to bring something. You're going to bring something. We're going to go. And then lastly, it's often done through human history to move up socially. Entertaining is done with people at the same social stratosphere or a little bit higher so that you can climb. This is just what humans do. That's what entertaining is. That's Southern hospitality. That is not biblical hospitality. Let me show you what biblical hospitality looks like. First of all, it's inclusive. Everyone's invited. If you're there, you're there. Number two, it's service-oriented. It's not done to gain favor or move up socially, but rather to serve other people. Number three, it often blurs the line between guest and host. Jesus did this all the time. He would come in, sometimes he'd sit, sometimes he'd come in, sit, and he'd start talking, and he'd address the whole room like he's the host. Sometimes he'd take the bread, and he'd break it. Hey, what's not your bread? No, I'm breaking it. Sometimes they'd run out of wine, he'd just make more. Boom, who's the host now, right? That's what Jesus does, right? That's just what, Jesus blurs the line. Fourth, it's not a thing you do, it's a way of life. It's an attitude of the heart, right? Number five, it's often done out of generosity to serve and to share, not to gain something. And then lastly, it treats all people equally. Jesus often would give examples of dinner parties, and he would say, why are you just inviting your friends and the people that are like you? Why don't you go into the highways and the byways and invite people who are poor? Jesus was equally at ease with people who are uppity up or downity downs, right? There was no difference in that. So it treats all people equally as if they all have inherent worth. So that's a destruction of Southern hospitality as the invitation to Christ. Not that entertaining is bad, it's just not what Jesus is talking about. So be free from that. But hospitality is also incredibly difficult because it's a deep heart thing. So why don't we do it? Why aren't we more hospitable as people? Why do we tend to swell up when there are people who are very different than us? Why are we not more open? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, fear. It's just fear of the unknown, right? I don't quite understand you, and you're different than me. Sometimes people hide behind their children and say, I don't want my kids exposed to anything. I don't want my kids exposed to that difficult idea. They're too young. That's uncomfortable for me, so we hide behind that. Sometimes there's a sense of scarcity, like not enough, like I don't have a big enough backyard. We conflate hospitality with entertaining. So we think, I don't have a big enough backyard. I don't have a big enough side yard. I don't have enough stuff. I don't have enough time. Like, hey, I can fit you in next January, right? Because we're really busy people. I don't have enough space, And then lastly, this is my big one, just general self-centeredness. It's just easier and more fun for me to hang out with people I already like. It's just easier. And so I'm selfish. I don't want to. I'd prefer not to. Go ahead and take a look at these words. Do these words describe Jesus really well? Nah, not at all, actually. So, that's the hard part. So, if that's what it is, then what is hospitality? What is Jesus inviting us to? What is the New Testament inviting us to? It's inviting us to this verse, and Paul actually writes it out quite beautifully in Romans 15. Paul describes what kind of heart thing what this looks like. In Romans 15, he says this: "May the God who gives endurance and encouragement give you the same attitude of mind." So again, what's Paul after? That we would set the same internal attitude and motivation inside of our hearts toward each other that Christ Jesus had, so that with one mind and one voice you may glorify the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And then he goes on to say, "Accept one another, then, just as Christ accepted you, in order to bring praise to God." This is what Paul says hospitality looks like. It's this word, philoxenia, that has also tethered in this word accept. The word that Paul uses here for accept is an interesting word with interesting implications. It means this. It's the word accept. It means to receive to oneself. As somebody comes in, basically they're saying there's no barriers between me and you, and I receive you to me. There's nothing between us. I'm not putting up walls or barriers. I receive you. Number two, to admit to someone to your society or in your fellowship. You're here. When you're here, you're family. It's turning a stranger into a neighbor and a neighbor into a friend. There's a sense of bringing somebody in. And then to receive and to treat with kindness. This is what Paul says marks Christian life. This is one of the foundational virtues, one of many virtues, but one of the core virtues. Because it's exactly how Christ treats us, doesn't it? In essence, what Paul is saying is that hospitality is not just something you do, it's a person that you are. And it's an action birthed out of your personhood, and that hospitality creates space. A bubble, if you will. And in that bubble, what's incredible is you can actually create a little bubble where somebody else can experience the love of God. I hope that you've had this in your life. I know many of you have. You ever had somebody who's created that kind of bubble? Where when you're inside of it, you feel known, valued, listened to? You mess up royally. You really mess up. But they don't beat you up. They come beside and say, listen, your failure doesn't define you. It's not the deepest part of you. There's something deeper and better. And God loves that. God died for that. Let's not forget. Your failure doesn't define you. And they've refused to give up on you, even though everyone else does. Somebody who's incredibly loyal, they just listen really well. They're for you, and you know it to your core. You ever felt that way? Somebody who doesn't have an agenda, they just like you. In a world filled with fitting in, when you edit yourself to try to make other people accept you, they actually just like you. And all that fear and all that weird shame just melts away because they like you. You ever felt that way? This is a gift. When you're with somebody and it's just joy, it's just fun. And when you're with them, it feels like somehow you've been with God. That's hospitality. That's someone receiving themselves, receiving you into themselves, welcoming you with kindness, being open to someone who is different. And if you've ever experienced that, that is a sacred thing. It's a God thing. Because this is how God treats us. He welcomes us this way. In fact, some of those words, some of you will notice, are fascinatingly similar to another list that Paul makes about the way that the Spirit of God looks when it's involved in our lives. This kind of bubble, this is what Paul is saying. He's saying, you and I have the incredible ability to live in such a way that we can create that bubble for other people so that they might experience the very goodness of God like we have experienced the goodness of God. We can create little bubbles where they can experience that, and in doing so, this is so radical and so desperately needed, and our souls thirst for this so deeply that when we even experience a hint of it, it can change us, because this does not describe the world. These bubbles don't exist in the world. And so to create them with God's help, to be the kind of person who wants to create that for other people and invite them into it, that is incredibly transformative. Do you see? This is hospitality. The bravest thing my grandfather ever did was fight in World War II. But let me tell you the most gospel thing he ever did. Some of you know I was adopted. When he found out that his daughter, my mother, could not have kids, they had to adopt. And they were on a waiting list for months and months and months. And then finally, on November 17th, I came home, and I was actually going through some photo albums. And I came across this photo. This is the very first time that my grandfather laid eyes on me. Does that look like a man who isn't going to accept that child as his biological grandson? The most gospel thing that Philip did is accept me as his grandson. That's the most gospel thing that this man did. He created a bubble where I felt unconditional love. And I was dealt aces with my grandparents. God gave me some aces, and some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. The love and the care and the nurture that can come, and I was not his biological grandchild, and you never would have known it. He created that bubble. This is hard work. This is very hard work. This is a virtue. That's why it must be practiced, because it does not come naturally in the Spirit of God. It's difficult. It's difficult. And it reminds me of The Incredibles. Stay with me. I promise I'm going somewhere. Do you remember? You know The Incredibles, right? You know The Incredibles? Okay. There's the oldest daughter, Violet. You know the oldest daughter. Now, every member of the Incredible family has a superpower. The mom's like elastic. The dad's super strong. Dash is like super fast. And then Jack's a mutant baby. I don't know what he is. But Violet's superpower is she can actually create these force fields. And she creates these force fields. Now, the thing is, as we get to know Violet, early in the movie, she's trying to master this power, but she's a teenager going through adolescence. And she's changing, and things are very hard. And so she's trying to get better at it. And so we see her, and she's shaping these little force bubbles, but they're not all there all the time. Sometimes they pop pretty quickly. Sometimes she can't hold it for very long. Sometimes she can only make a little one that's this big. And sometimes she can't make it that big. And sometimes when she tries, it just fizzles out, right? But then as she practices and practices and practices, she gets a little bit better. And she can eventually create a force bubble that's like in her, and then it encompasses her. And then there's this moment where her and Jack are in trouble, and she creates one, and they're in it together, and then it pops, and then she makes another one. Do you know what I'm saying? So she's practicing and getting better. And there's this moment at the end of the movie where the bad guy, Syndrome, has this giant robot, and he's about to step and crush on the entire family. And they're there, and the Elastigirl can't get him out fast enough, and the dad can't stop the foot because he's not strong enough, and they're gonna get crushed. And in that moment, Violet, who has been practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing and getting better and better, actually creates a force bubble that actually can fit her entire family. And her mom looks at her and goes, "Good job, honey." It's this amazing moment, and she gets this little smirk because she's been practicing and practicing and practicing. This is what you and I can do with these bubbles of gospel hospitality. At first, we'll be weak and flimsy, and we won't be able to hold it for very long at all. But with God's help, as we practice, we can get better and better to be open to those who are wildly different than us. We can actually perhaps create a bubble that's big enough for us to live in, and also perhaps even big enough for them to step into and experience the love of God through us. We can be conduits of God to bring goodness and love and acceptance into this world so that other people can experience it. Now, how do we do this? Now, this sermon is very short on application. It's the same application that we've talked about last week. We're going to talk about for the next couple weeks. It's pretty easy. First, you know people who are strangers. They're not like you. They're not from the same part of town or the part of the world as you. They're just different than you. And hospitality is turning strangers into neighbors and neighbors into friends. And what's the first step in that? Number one, learn folks' names. Learn the name. If you got neighbors, learn the name. The new person at work, learn the name. You got to learn their name. Names are hugely important. This past week, we were visiting our friends, and they were talking about this this pastor at this church that they used to work at, and he's like, what's her face? The girl that was in the thing, and what's her name? What's her name? I can't remember people's names. And their colleagues are like, you're a pastor. It's unacceptable. You work with this person. Like, do you know how disrespectful that is to not know their name? Like, know their name. Learn it. And secondly, learn their story. Sit with their story. Be a safe enough person. Ask questions. Hey, where are you from? What's going on? If you sit with somebody's story and you establish yourself as the kind of person who's safe to sit with their life story, some beautiful things can happen. And, of course, pray. Bring God into this. Well, actually, you don't bring God into it or take him along with him. He's already there. But the idea is this is not something we do for God. This is something we do with God. And he directs us and changes. And he's the one who creates those bubbles anyway. All that love and joy that we have, he's the one who is the source of that anyway. So, that's hospitality. So I guess the final question is why? Why should we do this? Why go through this effort? Because this nobody wants to hear this. I know. You didn't come here thinking, I know. This is going to be, it's just hard. It goes against human nature. It goes against all of our selfish proclivities as human beings. So why should we do this? Why? Well, a couple of thoughts. One, I'd like you to think about how Jesus treated you when you were a stranger to him. Remember when you were a stranger to God? Or maybe even an enemy? When he walked away through stubborn disobedience? Or maybe you're just so busy that he got lost in a priority list. How did Jesus treat you when you turned around? Was he ever closed off? Did his openness ever run out? Did his mercy reach an end? How did Jesus treat you when you were a stranger to him? I'll tell you how he treated us. While we were sinners, enemies of God, he died for us. That's pretty open. Nailed open, in fact. So that's reason one. But there's another reason too. God wants to have sons and daughters that look like him. And if we're stubborn and we refuse, he'll find someone else. And we will not lead anyone, certainly not toward Christ. And he will find someone else who is willing and obedient enough to develop this virtue. Because that's what this world desperately needs. And that's what those who don't know God desperately need. And God knows that. And he will find people. So we will forfeit that. and we'll forfeit becoming like his sons and daughters in his likeness. That's what's at stake here. So, let's pray. Jesus, this is hard stuff. It's deeply challenging to our selfishness and fears, our sense of not enough. And we cannot do this on our own strength, in our own flesh, in our own minds, with our own spirit. We need your help. This is not natural. This is not easy. But with your spirit, even the impossible can be done. Would you help us train to become a little bit more like you every day? Would you help us create these bubbles of the gospel? Would you help us inhabit that bubble first and feel your love and goodness and kindness and joy and peace on us first? And then as we drink into that fully, may we create bubbles that other people can experience that too. It is the best thing we've ever found in this universe. Help us share it with others. Help us be people who are hospitable. Help us develop this virtue with your help. It's in your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.